Okay, stupendous. Again, thank you, team, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate everyone joining. Um, like I was just saying a little bit earlier, Mick Woodward from our team, who is one of our GRC analysts, is going to be joining us and talking about governance, risk, and compliance, particularly in the domains of how to understand an organization's risk posture, what types of security and compliance frameworks you can use to manage an organization's risk posture, how it relates to an organization's attack surface, that kind of stuff. One of the things I was just noting a little bit earlier is that even while GRC stuff can sometimes come off a little bit dry to folks, it is still really, really important to most organizations because they have the two main lenses of understanding their practical attack surface and what a malicious actor can really do to their business throughout a particular attack vector and monetizing that attack vector, be it something like a ransomware attack. And then again, the lens of compliance and risk management, where the organization may have various regulatory requirements that they are obligated to meet, or they have various legal obligations to meet with their customers. Another particular note that's important when it comes to GRC and compliance is the fact that at the end of the day, you have to demonstrate as an organization your security posture being robust. Using compliance frameworks is a good way to do that. And it's particularly important to do that to reduce customer friction in the contracting process and earn their trust quickly. So to a lot of cybersecurity and business leaders, GRC, governance, risk, and compliance is particularly important because that's going to help them earn additional revenue and build their revenue stream by, again, building on customer trust. So that being said, Mick, we're going to have you share out your screen and we'll have you jump right into it.
All right. Well, thank you, Christian. He actually covered quite a lot of what I was going to say, but on a very, very high level. So he definitely teed me up there. So, all right. As Christian mentioned, I am the compliance or part of the compliance side of this company. And so I've got my hand in a little bit of the GRC pie, just kind of providing a lot of helpful work in terms of helping develop policies, helping with risk management, helping develop a good idea of compliance standard, and of course, why that's all relevant to cybersecurity. That's going to be a whole big enchilada there. So first off, I want to throw out that we are not affiliated with the Illuminati. This is just here because as I continue to work, I noticed the role of threes and triangles came up quite a bit. So I decided roll with it and freak everybody out that way. But to it, we have introduction here. What is GRC? As mentioned a few times, GRC is an umbrella term and it covers three primary domains, especially within the cybersecurity space: governance, risk management, and compliance. I like to think of it as the who, what, when, where, and why, and how for an organization's cybersecurity posture, how it's developed, when it needs to be rolled out, what needs to be done, all that going on. And kind of got a little bit of a visual element here to kind of help manage everything. We each have our different domains that are kind of all in operation with each other. And in terms of specific tasks, it's also pretty straightforward. Governance, developing the policies, procedures, developing management decisions, having leadership get involved and actually oversee what is being done, and making sure that everything is looking good. And if they got to crack the whip, then obviously we got to have somebody who's holding the whip, right? Risk over down in the corner, researching, analyzing, tracking, and handling organizational risks, technical and non-technical. So technical will obviously be for our cybersecurity side, a lot of penetration tests, a lot of dealing with malicious actors, a lot of being aware of what the field looks like that's facing your organization that, you know, obviously is trying to take you down or put some hurt on you. But there's also the element of non-technical risk, and we'll get into that a little bit more in depth when we get to the actual risk portion of this discussion. But it's not just your, you know, weakness in your server AV that you need to be worried about. There's a whole lot of other elements that go involved with risk and being aware of that to be able to best mitigate that, to keep you up and running, and obviously keep what you need secure, remaining secure. And for compliance, that provides a huge level of oversight. Typically, compliance is broken down into what a lot of people will dictate as voluntary and compulsory sort of compliance standards. So it's voluntary because some standards are really, really good. They make you look really good because they demonstrate that you have a very solid security posture, that you've got good operational procedures in place, that you're just fantastic person to do business with, that you're not probably going to be hacked overnight. But there's also more compulsory compliance, and that's typically depending on whatever industry that you're actually working in. A very common one that people throw around, and very one that I'm fairly well attuned to, is HIPAA. That is your healthcare organization compliance standard, where it's all about the management and protection of PHI and those people who will be impacting PHI, protected health information. So obviously, you don't want to go to the doctor and have somebody find out that, you know, all of your fun spinal injury information is now being leaked all over the internet. So I don't want to obviously have that come back and, you know, have somebody decide to sell you some fancy spine medicine at a fancy premium there. Let's see. Moving on. Do you have any questions about this very, very high level overview before I kind of open this up a little bit more?
No questions in the chat, Mick. I think you're doing a great job.
Fantastic.
I
So
love the whip reference with compulsory. It's
yeah,
spot on.
yeah. So with HIPAA especially, you know, you don't want to see the wall of shame. That will come up a little bit later. But speaking of which, depending on the time frame of everything tonight, my intention is to at least get through the governance and risk side of things. If there's time, I will lightly touch on compliance, but I'll give you guys a heads up. Compliance is a massive, massive beast to deal with. That's essentially where I live in terms of what I do. So that's going to take a little bit more of a deeper dive to actually get into how you do compliance work. So I want to kind of come at these GR sides specifically tonight, and we'll go from there. But so why do these three domains get lumped together? It seems kind of straightforward as well, just in like how governance, risk management, and compliance, how all those are, you know, what you get on the label is what you get in the can. It's kind of what goes on here, because you can see just from what I described how these elements all play into each other, specifically for cybersecurity here. And the way I like to emphasize this is what I call the umbrella example. So let's say you are having a meeting. You got to go to a very important meeting with your boss there, and you have to wear a very nice suit. You got to impress. You got to, you know, make everybody look like you know what you're doing. But you look at the weather report, or you look outside, you see there's some rain clouds developing overhead. This is kind of where you can see where GRC might show up in terms of like a practical elemental thing. So with governance, you can simply make a policy that, hey, I'm going to keep my umbrella in the car just in case it rains. You don't have to do it just for this specific meeting. You can do it all the time. And you can also, you know, check once a week, maybe even every day if you're like that neurotic, to just make sure that your umbrella is still in your car. That's kind of a little personal policy and procedure for you. Your risk management, well, you're being very aware that what the weather report's going to look like, what the rain clouds are looking like, and you know what the walk to your car, to and from your car, might do to your very fancy clothes before your meeting. Your compliance, well, as a human being, you like being warm and dry. So that's obviously a one compliance standard there. But a big one is you do not want to show up for your boss's meeting looking like you just got back from the water park, right? So that's your compliance standard. You have to meet your boss's standard as well as your own personal standard to not be chilly inside your office building. So all of that comes together in sort of like a relatively real world GRC example. But what I also really like about this is that it provides an insight into the flexibility that you might be able to find within the GRC domain. While I had mentioned how you can have your umbrella in your car, that be a policy, you can also develop an entirely different policy where, hey, you just keep a spare change of clothes in the car. Boom, it's easy to, you know, manage that in terms of a different kind of policy, but still gets the job done. Or you could also manage the risk side of things in a different way by saying, hey, let's just have this meeting on Zoom and nobody has to go anywhere out in the rain. that's another way to mitigate that risk that has been facing you. And I struggle with this one because it's very hard to find a compliance standard that you could just simply elect to and not to do. Obviously, with your voluntary standards, you can choose whether or not you want to do that. It just affects your business posture in terms of dealing with any clients or just however you want your own peace of mind. But at the same time, companies can take a totally different direction and go with a different compliance standard that is required from there. And in this case, your different compliance standard could be, hey, I'm taking this job and shoving it, and I'm going to get a new boss who does not actually have a dress code for me. So that's another approach. Please do not take my word for that, because I'm not a career counselor if you decide to go that route. But I'm just saying that is a flexible element to it that does exist. So just because there are these standards in place for all of these domains, it doesn't mean there's a one-size-fits-all solution for any single one of them. And it's all just going to depend largely on whatever your organization is doing, what it requires, what is required of that organization, and essentially what your organization is capable of doing. So I'll get into some of those more details further on as well. But I also want to point out this sort of this interrelationship that is going on between all three of these elements here. So again, I like my triangles in this situation, but you can kind of see how there's not a unidirectional path for any one of these elements. They all kind of impact each other to a significant degree, which is why they all get lumped together in this field within cybersecurity. So governance dictates how your organizational risk is managed, but also demands the awareness of the risk itself for it to be a proper, management system. Risk will dictate the standard of compliance, but also illuminates what risks an organization might face by having your compliance standards be set by a very large overarching system there. And of course, your compliance standards will also dictate your governance standards, and vice versa. So it all kind of plays into each other in that very, circle of life kind of situation there. But we're about to run into the nitty gritty of, like I mentioned, just the GR side of things. But any other good questions on that before we keep rolling?
Looking pretty good here. You're spot on with the analogies. I love it.
Cool. All right, then. As we get into it, also I apologize, my dog is sitting right here, so it's joy of Zoom work, right? So if we look at the nature of GRC, we see different levels at play. We see who's in charge, what's at stake, what timelines look like, and you may place different importance on what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, how it needs to be done, just depending on how you want to look at it. Your blue team side of things might actually look and say, well, we need this level of rigor to protect our organization, while your HR manager might be like, well, we just need to actually make sure people aren't doing stupid things. So you can again see where these sort of elements are more specified, and that's why we get this whole overarching system in place here. This graphic element right here, the GRC capability model, this is developed by OSEG, the Open Compliance and Ethics Group. This is one of the big organizations that are pushing for good GRC practices across the board. OSEG actually has their own compliance certification. It's fairly simple to get, I believe. So I've been looking into it. It doesn't seem all too crazy to go for. But that's, it's got some different elements on how all of this can be applied within GRC practically for an organization there. So that's just one model of it, though. There's not a single model that goes on. So, but moving on into our actual nitty gritty, I'm going to start with the G side. You want to start where the start is, governance. So for anybody who's visiting this page, I've got some key takeaways of everything that I'm going to cover tonight, just a little Cliff's Notes version for you there. So that's going to just show up in all of those little sections. And of course, without government, we cannot think of some of our great governing people. And Honest Abe will tell us if it's on the internet and it must be true and you cannot question it. So obviously I'm on the internet, so you cannot question me in any capacity. But of the three domains, GRC governance, again, fairly simple to understand. It's right there on the label. I like to think of it as rubber meeting the road in terms of your actual people of your organization making decisions on where things need to be. And again, going with our sort of triangle 3-point situation, I kind of view this as three large overarching points there. Governance will deal with the policies and procedures that an organization will need to develop, the management and oversight of these policies and procedures, and the planning of initiatives relating to them. So when it comes to policies and procedures, that's kind of what you expect as well, but there's a lot of flexibility into what goes into that. All good cybersecurity programs have good documentation. That is our bread and butter. If you have a nice, lovely set of ISMS or WISP documentation, you are my best friend, and I absolutely love you for making my job that much easier, because that means that you are not only organized as an organization yourself, but you are providing that insight to everybody that you are potentially working with. Not only is that helping you in your organization that you can get things done very easily, but it also means everybody else can understand that you are essentially a trustworthy organization to do business with, and we can see where exactly your standards are going to lie. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be a perfect system. You might be deficient in some ways, but you can at least, if you have that good documentation, you can at least determine what things can be improved and what can be recommended from there. But as I mentioned, this is some rubber meeting the road concept. This is the development of the policies will dictate from a high level what an organization expects for different elements within its operations there. So everything from an acceptable use policy that a lot of employees wind up having to sign on their very first day, so they know, not to just pull this random thumb drive with a potential virus that they pulled off the subway, that they just pulled it off the train and it is now in their computer and now expose the entire intranet there. So that's a policy that's simply in there. And a procedure would be how actually a plan is implemented or what systems are in place to enforce this policy. Everything from what is your AV standard, what is your password policy standard, how are you actually managing what people are doing. So with that documentation, it is well understood within your organization what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. So the more robust that is, the better you can operate. And also the big thing, the cheaper you can operate. Because if you have all sorts of people scattering, trying to figure out which way is up, when you simply can just print up a poster that says that way is up, you just saved yourselves a lot of resource time and a lot of money by simply defining what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. So there's a very big practical element, not only for our cybersecurity standard, but also a good business practice as well. And when I reach the end of this specific governance thing, I actually have a good guideline system developed by NIST that kind of helps organizations develop what needs to be considered for their policy writing. So we'll get into that in just a little bit there. Now, obviously, next big thing, that when you have the policies procedures, you need to have the sheriffs there to enforce them. So Spider-Man is my sheriff here, so he's going to just hang around and watch us very intimidatingly. But the idea is simply, without people to actually ensure that these policies and procedures are being done, well, they're not going to get done. It's that simple. You can throw all the nicest documentation and policy in front of all the people at the same time that you want, but if nobody's actually reading them, then what's the point? So part of the leadership and part of the management system there goes into developing a team, even if it's just people who are, this just a side assignment. They might have a larger duty within the organization, but if they are assigned to be a sort of manager on the security team, that can help actually provide the push to get some things done. And typically a security team for especially cybersecurity is made up of a usual typical number of roles. So you got your security officer. They provide the high-level oversight of all security initiatives, making, again, sure those things that are dictated in the policy are what is happening. Compliance manager, sometimes that's actually also rolled into security officer as well, just depending on whatever is going on. But compliance manager is mainly concerned with making sure that all these security initiatives are being done with consideration to whatever compliance standard needs to be met. Product security officer, hey, if you got a product, you got to make sure that you are following best practices and making sure that not only is your product safe, but everything related to the product is safe as well. So if you've got exposed databases that your product is feeding into, well, guess what? You've just opened up a whole big can of worms that you might have to wind up paying a lot of money to go and fix, or see yourself in front of a judge about. So that's a very big thing to just have just a product security oversight being done there. IT security officer / manager, that's more of your corporate element of things. Again, that's making sure your internal networks, all of your devices, and all of your people operating the devices are properly set up and good to go with all those procedures that way. Facility security, if you are operating your own server rooms, if you have your own system that's actually, you have a building essentially, you got to make sure that the building's going to be good. That's as simple as that can be. HR manager, making sure you got the right people for the right job. And of course, a big thing is conducting background checks that will come in during the sort of risk side of things as we talk about internal risk from a high level. And this is a less common thing, but although it's growing more in commonality these days, a CIO / CISO, so Chief Information or Chief Information Security Officer. These are the guys at the big tables that are providing the very strong oversight from, the top down. Again, they have the C-level suite. They're hanging around with the big wigs. They are the ones really pushing for getting a lot of this stuff done. And oftentimes the CIO, CISO will become the security officer in and of themselves. So it all just kind of depends on what all is happening for the organization in terms of their scope, in terms of how much money they have, and how much they really need to keep things secure. But I've only covered a few of these roles. There are plenty more that can be expanded out, and a lot of these will wind up having multiple tasks that they wind up needing to do simply to get the job done. So a lot of times, many of these roles are involved, especially in sort of incident response practices. If you have an incident response issue, well, you need a security officer making sure that the response is appropriate. You probably need a compliance manager to come in and manage anything that needs to come up, such as if there's a data breach that needs to be addressed by an organization. HR manager, making sure that, if it was a malicious actor within the organization, that they are, canned and taken care of that way. So those are more specific tasks that are more related to cybersecurity side of things. But it looks like there's a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. So I'm going to hit pause really quick and let's take a look at these.
Yeah, not a problem. So real quick. So Ryan's first question is a really good one here. And if you want to hit on it, let me know, or I'm happy to hit on it. So he says, how do these personnel typically, quote unquote, bridge the gap in communication with their IT division within a company?
So that's actually a very good question. That's usually where a lot of this IT security officer comes in. So they might have a split role if they are an internal IT system, if they have an internal IT system that way, if they're managing everything on their own. Well, that's obviously a pretty easy branch because it's usually some level of manager or leadership within that IT component of the company, and they can figure out how to distribute information that way. Or if they are working with more of an IT MSP situation, then they can provide, some of the technical feedback to the IT MSP, and whoever's in charge of dealing with the communications on that front winds up distributing some of that information to any employees or workforce members that are needing that information. So that's part of where these roles and responsibilities wind up coming into play here. Just making sure that we have a person who can communicate that information well and to the right parties at the right time. So hopefully that
Fantastic note that I want to just add to that. So Ryan, in my past experiences of working with enterprises, so a bit bigger than an organization that might leverage one particular IT MSP, but with larger organizations, when you're formulating a security program as a chief information security officer, what's important is to embed security processes into the native organization processes that already exist. For example, human resources is already going to be probably doing some level of background checks, right? So when it comes to defining onboarding and offboarding processes, that is something that's going to be very native to them, right? And interfacing with them on a regular basis about that, right, then covers that particular domain of security, right? And it's particularly important how kind of like Mick has lined this out that it rather than the chief information security officer just being the blame storm for everything, that they define the demarcation points of those roles and responsibilities to other individuals who exist within the organization that are champions, right? So the same would also go for, let's say, systems integration and software development lifecycle stuff, right? So the chief information security officer should be working closely with a chief development officer, chief technology officer, chief information officer, whomever is overseeing essentially the software development lifecycle, so that what they can do is shoehorn in elements of security controls like dynamic application security testing or static application security testing into the CI/CD or into the SDLC, right? And the great thing is that that will actually make the software development process a lot more fast or a lot faster and more efficient, right? So it's a native benefit for that, then your software development team, and then security is kind of like baked in right from the default. One of the things that I also recommend for most enterprises is that your security team should be meeting together on a regular cadence, no less than, I think, on a monthly basis. And in some circumstances, I have done a lot of different security team work for enterprises, having them on a weekly basis. So that's a really good juncture point in which you can go through an agenda saying, hey, here are the human resources items we're going to hit on. Here are the items we're going to hit on with technology. Here are the items we're going to hit on with facility security and physical security every single week, right? Checking those items, making sure everybody's good and that they have their tasks to move on with, right, for the next week or month or whatever it may be. So very good question there.
Mhm. Is there any other good questions that we saw in here?
He's got one additional one he put above. So how do you specifically evaluate what is at stake? Are you
That-
looking at third order effects like business continuity planning, etc.?
That will actually come up during risk management. So that's a nice little preview of what is to come ahead. So we'll get to that in just a short little bit. So one more question here. What depth of technical knowledge should a CIO, CISO on the type of products and services they offer, or can they have a strong technical team to back them up? So certainly they can have a strong technical team to back up those decisions there. Again, I am less privy to the full extent of a CIO and CISO. I'm more of a boots on the ground kind of guy. Those guys are a little bit above me. Christian, if you actually have any insight onto CIO, CISO functionality.
At the end of the day, based off of my personal experiences of interfacing with a lot of different CISOs out there, anytime where a CISO has some fundamental grounding in the technology and in the industry that they're overseeing for that particular business and enterprise, they're going to be a lot more successful. Because at the end of the day, when you're managing a team, it's inherently easy for human beings to say, and team members to say, hey, we need more people. Like, we have a problem, we need more people. And what it is perhaps they're not thinking strategically on, well, maybe they actually just need to improve processes or tooling. You know what I mean? Or that they don't see some type of technical incongruity or issue that if they tackled, they don't actually need more people. So when you have somebody who is technically competent in the domain and they understand that particular industry they're overseeing. So let's say being a CISO for a large retail business, right? They're going to be able to understand the ins and outs of that quite better and be able to provide a lot more direction and quote unquote bullshit check people. If a CISO does not have the prerequisite technical skill set and they have to rely on their team to kind of interpret things, one of the things that might be a challenge is that sometimes the technical teammates that they're relying on and that they're delegating down to, right, they may be able to communicate from a technical fashion, but don't necessarily have business operations expertise, right? And so that technical person might not communicate well to the CISO, and the CISO might not be able to realize how to, change that particular technical challenge and realize it into something that could be put into like a particular business operation or initiative that could be planned, next quarter out or the next couple quarters out, that kind of stuff. So certainly, the technical expertise is really important there. And then again, not just the technical, but industry expertise. If you take a CISO who's been working, let's say, for fintech companies, and then you put them in the area of working for a hospital system, they're going to have a difficult time, because they're just completely different types of business challenges that they face, different types of threat actors, different types of risks, different technology stacks, So good question there.
And one more question that came in with Nicholas. I actually think this can be addressed fairly succinctly there. So you're right. There's a lot of privacy legislation that is come up. And yes, you can include a chief privacy officer into that. But if you look at it, a lot of times the compliance manager winds up becoming that sort of role as well. Because if they got to keep track of what their regulatory standards need to be, well, you might as well have somebody managing all of that on one front. Depending on the size, you might require a sort of privacy officer just to focus on that element of it. But a lot of times that winds up getting compacted into either the compliance manager role, or sometimes it's spread across a few different roles as well, going back again to sort of CISO situation there. So hopefully that was understandable enough. So then the last little element to the governance side of things that I want to check in on, planning of initiatives. So while we have our security team in place, we've got some good policies and procedures going on. That's not the end of it. It is an ongoing process because the cyber threats keep changing. The internal threats are constant. All this sort of stuff needs to be updated on a regular cadence, and they need to sort of develop an ongoing understanding of what's going on, what needs to change. And of course, businesses change all the time. If you have an organization that's been involved with healthcare and they decide, you know what, screw it, we're going to go do video games now. Well, now they have to realize how their whole situation is going to shift over. And now they might have to deal with an entirely different process of compliance, new set of policies, new threats facing them. So the planning of initiatives just keeps everybody on the same page and always on a forward trajectory, keeping things moving. So, and in terms of cybersecurity as well, you can also be planning various initiatives that relate to what need to be done to continue to protect the organization, such as planning for penetration tests, being aware of what needs to be done on that front, planning for any sort of implementation of new systems that might propose a new risk to the organization, whether it's a product system, whether it's a new internal system, whatever that is. As these changes are occurring, so too must the management procedures and of course the policies in place. So that is what is a sort of living, breathing entity within that domain as well. So with all that, we move on to risk management. And no, we are not talking risk. We're talking Stratego here. I'm sorry. I'm going to disappoint everybody with my very lame dad jokes. I have to. So it's just part of me. So what is risk? Well, that is a very, very complex question that can take up a 5-hour lecture in and of itself. I'm going to go with some very basic level things. Here's a definition from NIST. An effective uncertainty on or within information and technology. Cybersecurity risks relate to the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information, data, and information or control systems, and reflect the potential adverse impacts. Okay, what does that actually mean? I like to think of it very simply as what are the vulnerabilities an organization has, and what are the threats that might tackle those vulnerabilities. So less words you can say, the better, right? So I think that is what a more refined or more beat down definition of risk is for a practical matter there. So with risk, of course, you need to analyze the vulnerability and threat that is facing your organization. And again, if I'm dealing with cybersecurity people, even if you are brand new to the field, you've probably heard of a vulnerability and a threat before. So I've got a couple of little link definitions there about what a vulnerability is and various other little threats scattered throughout. But again, I'm going to work out the assumption that you understand a vulnerability is simply a weakness in a system. And a threat is whatever seeks to expose that weakness and do some damage, do some harm. And if they're an actual person, might actually get some benefit out of it that way. So we think of hackers and corporate espionage as being a big cybersecurity threat. That's true. That is what a lot of people immediately default to. But there's also other vulnerabilities and other threats to consider that are maybe even less malicious. They may not even be conscious threats. So there are certainly theatrical and less theatrical versions of vulnerabilities and threats out there, but we sometimes wind up overlooking very obvious threats right in front of us. So the one thing that I use here as an example is the lack of a fire extinguisher near a server room. That's a risk. If your server just suddenly spontaneously combusts and you don't have a fire extinguisher or sprinkler system nearby, well, you've just lost the server room, essentially, right? Unless you have a fire truck show up within the next 10 seconds and aim at just that right room. That is a non-technical risk that I kind of mentioned early on in the thing. I don't know if I need to go into the technical risk elements of it because we are cybersecurity and we deal a lot with pen testing education with these mentorship things. So again, I think we kind of understand what that is, but I kind of want to approach risk from a multifaceted perspective here. So we have our external risks, our more typical things we consider the malicious actors, supply chain problems, even geopolitical disputes going on. With the whole Russia situation, we're actually seeing an uptick in a lot of these cyber attacks that are happening across the world. So that plays into what an external risk factor will look like. We also have internal risk in terms of people who are internal to the organization and malicious, such as a disgruntled employee who decides to suddenly leak everybody's financial information out on the internet. Well, you got to consider that in terms of what's happening to your organization, but also various accidents happen as well. So sometimes people just unknowingly leak huge things out into the internet or, just public situations. And you got to do some cleanup on that and manage what are you going to do when that happens. Environmental risks, earthquakes, fires, floods, hurricanes, all that goes on, including sometimes even alien invasions. There is alien insurance out there apparently, and that's a good way to mitigate that risk in case anybody's curious. Operational risk, working with third parties always opens up some degree of risk to your organization, whether it's an operational system or whatever they are bringing to your own product lines or whatever exposure they have to your own internal systems that way. So you got to figure out how these systems are going to play well in order to not completely tank whatever you're doing. Technical risk, lack of geographical redundancy in the event of regional downtime. That tends to be a pretty big thing that comes up if, again, you have a big service offering and that goes down. Well, you would need to be prepared for that. These are very, very, brief descriptions of all these risk elements. Again, we could go on for hours and hours on that, but we have other things to go and see and discuss tonight. So evaluating risk. So I think this is going to touch on what Ryan was expecting. How do you evaluate risk? Well, it all depends on scoping. It's determined by what your organization is actually doing, where it is in terms of sort of grand scheme of things. If you are a startup of 5 people, well, you are much less likely to be targeted by an advanced threat out there, right? Because are they really going to know who you are to target you and bring you down? Probably not. But if you are a small startup of 5 people, but you happen to be involved in with DoD contracts, well, that elevates your risk level to a significant degree. And of course, you can have a multinational organization that faces huge risks. But if all they're doing is selling you like a free version of Angry Birds, well, you may not be as, a huge a target as you might expect. So it all depends on how you are scoping your level of risk and what specific type of risk you are looking at. So I brought in this little table here. This is a common matrix that is used for pen testing risk assessments there. And it's based on magnitude of impact versus ease of exploitation. Again, this is more akin to the external threats, your cybersecurity issues from malicious actors that way. But there is some degree of overlap that can be considered with this situation. Exploitation can be, a flexible term in this regard. Because again, if we go back to our server room example, well, we have a significant magnitude of impact if all of your servers catch on fire. And ease of exploitation, if you can change that to ease of incident, how likely is it for that server room to catch on fire? Well, you can kind of rate that based on whatever the system room looks like or whatever compensating controls are in place. So that's a conceptual model of how one can do it. There are several different models that come into play. Let's see, I put in a link somewhere so I put in another link that is much more robust from ISACA. They have a whole big page that I don't want to break down for you guys because it'll take some time, but that's the idea. You need to consider what your organization is doing, what is facing the organization to determine what is the best route to evaluate the true risk to the organization. Because once you have that evaluation in mind, you can figure out how to best manage that. And 3 very common ways to manage a risk is fix it, monitor it, accept it. Now, we don't say fix it. We typically say remediate or resolve it. But there's a few other different methods you could actually do, but these tend to be the big 3 that go on. So remediate, like I said, is fixing it. If you have a flaw in your code that exposes a lot of things, well, fix the code. Easier said than done in most cases, right? But that is one method of doing it. Monitoring it is, okay, it's there. We know what is at stake by having it exposed like that. As long as we keep things on a level that, we don't anticipate there's going to be any significant threats in place, well, maybe we shouldn't throw money at it to try and fix it because, if the threats aren't there, is it actually that huge a risk to deal with? So sometimes that's a decent option. Sometimes it's not the best option because you have a lot of people that say, oh, we monitored this, but if their response isn't as quick as they would like, if the monitoring actually brought up a major incident, then that gets them into some trouble there. And then there's accept it. You understand it, it's there. You don't necessarily need to fix it. That is something that does come up. And sometimes it's not even a huge significant risk. So let's say you have a contract with Amazon to have your product be offered on their AWS service, but you don't want to spend a whole lot of money to have a regional backup. If you're in AWS East and you want to go to AWS West for your backup for regional redundancy, but that's a little bit out of your budget, you can accept the risk that, okay, well, if we go down in the East, so be it, we'll be down for X amount of time, or we'll be down until they fix it. That is an acceptable risk that you can wind up taking that way. But that all relates again to how all of this breaks down in terms of the practical aspect of what an organization needs to do in terms of managing that. Again, with the scope in mind and with also the understanding of what your organization is actually capable of, that is where the management comes into play. If you don't have a strong technical team to mitigate a risk or remediate a risk, then maybe you just accept it for a bit. Or if it's just going to cost way too much money and it's like this big a risk, you can kind of accept it and let it be. But so with all those domains together, that will actually bleed into compliance, but I don't know if we'll have enough time to cover that on a significant level, as I'm about to show you guys a couple of different examples or some guidelines and materials that are related to the practical element of the GR side of things. Let's see, I'll take some time to answer some questions real quick, unless Christian, you think you've got these.
Yeah, certainly. So real quick here. So Ryan asked a little bit about what are the best practices for internal reviews to mitigate the risks of leaks. I just provided him just a quick little bit of feedback and from a defense in depth approach, right? Like I'm going to assume he meant leaks and like a data breach, right, from a malicious actor. And one of the things I see a lot of times is someone will keep beating users over the head about user education. And user education is important, right? But you got like workstation controls, network controls, your authentication controls. And one of the things I see missed so often now, even when people have MFA enabled, they're like, oh, hey, well, these things are just going to happen, and we got MFA. How can you do better than that? Like, well, you got impossible travel controls enabled. Like, well, what's that? Like, oh, I don't know. When somebody logs in New York and then all of a sudden they log in from LA, that's not physically possible unless they're a magician. We can monitor those things and detect those things really easy and contain a threat actor. And they're like, oh, wow, that's cool. Well, but it is an MFA silver bullet. Like, no, you just send a prompt to somebody's phone when they're getting coffee in the morning. They think they're logging into their computer. Or what you do is you just prompt up a site with the fake username and password portal. And then when they put in their password, it then comes up with a little MFA code, right? Or a field for them to put in their code. And then you submit the code on their behalf. It's not that difficult to get past MFA anymore, right? So my general just suggestion was from a defense in depth approach to perhaps look at just initially CIS V8 implementation group 1 controls, right, to evaluate the org against, or even just taking the categories from that if the organization is not even that mature, and just asking yourselves again, like, well, what are the layers in which a malicious actor is going to permeate through an organization to then commit a data breach, right? The next one was in regards to how to best convey risks to various chiefs within an organization. And big note that I just kind of provided was that, and at the end of the day, guys, business leaders, they got a lot of things on their plate. They're processing a lot of data. They got a lot of shit going on, right? They do not have time for someone to try to explain to them on what a particular vulnerability weakness means, right? And all the technical jargon behind it. You're going to lose them fairly quickly, right? So at the end of the day, you have to be ready to communicate in the terms of money to them, right? They're running a business, right? So how does it impact the revenue stream, which is the money that's coming in? How does it impact their profitability, right? So we got basically the top line and the bottom line for the organization. And then what's the risk appetite for the organization and how much are they willing to accept something, right? Which is, there's always an element of they should be engaging their legal counsel with that, and how willing are they, of going to jail or losing their entire savings for that particular business, That being noted, wanted it just as an example for communicating. So my pen test reports that my company puts out, we're particularly proud of the quality of our work, right? And I don't sell my pen test report to my customers as like I'm a snake oil salesman. I always want to provide value. And one of the things I learned that provides a lot of value to my customers that has them keep returning to us for pen tests is because they're so thorough and they look so nice and they're well laid out. When a customer comes to us and we do a pen test and it looks really awesome and we demonstrate all that homework, they take that to their own prospects, their own customers. They're asking for a good pen test report. They don't quite trust them. And then they're able to earn more business now. They're able to reduce that customer friction, right? Get more business. So my pen test reports are essentially a piece of marketing content that they can use to increase their revenue stream and make them look good, right? And again, we're not lying or anything like that. If they've got a solid security posture, we'll demonstrate it and we'll show all the homework behind it. And if they don't, then like at least we're telling them how to go fix stuff. You know what I mean? And we're very specific about it. So that's how you need to communicate to any C-level folks is where's the money at, right? And if you're going to talk about brand reputation, because a lot of people have kind of caught on to like, oh, well, brand's really important. Brand is really important to businesses, but you're going to have to be ready to do the homework and demonstrate it to them, right? Because a lot of times they go, hey, fuck it, we'll just rebrand. Or, fuck it, we got cyber insurance. Why don't we just call our cyber insurance policy? You know what? I don't think our customers are going to do anything about it if they hear about that in the news, right? So there's a lot of hypotheticals you're going to be working with in that regard, right? So if you do want to talk about brand reputation, make sure you have really good illustrative examples. Hey, an organization that's in the same vertical as us doing the same type of stuff, last year they got hacked. Take a look at their stocks after they got hacked. They got wrecked. They lost 25%, right off their stock. Okay, booyah, there you go. Good example. So just make sure you got good data in that regard. Then continuing on here, there was Mike asked about how often, Mick, are you involved in our red teaming engagements? Do you send out the GRC guy to kind of gather how the company does and its day-to-day works and mitigations as a good vector to begin your engagement? That is one of the things that, so Mick is not involved in our regular red team engagements or anything like that, but certainly the different teams that we have do interface with one another, but certainly still not enough. So that is a big initiative for my organization, is to continue to do that, because it's more in the spirit of good purple teaming practices, right? And rather than a pen test report just talking about the technical vulnerabilities or weaknesses or the technical safeguards and controls, right? That allows my GRC team to also see in a pen test report, hey, the patterns that we're seeing from a technical standpoint also indicate that you got piss poor processes here, here, and here. Maybe you should consider implementing this type of policy. Here's some sample policy documentation that's on the SANS site here or there, that kind of stuff, as a good value add. Continuing on here, are government regulations actively policed and enforced in USA, or does the company, unless an investigation has an event, handle it in-house or depend on the event? It depends on the regulations, that kind of stuff. I mean, for example, HIPAA with the Office of Civil Rights, they don't actively go out and do audits that often. But I'll tell you what, if you have a data breach or something like that, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of Civil Rights, they're going to come in and audit you after you had your data breach, and then they'll find the piss out of you, you know. Same thing when it comes to anything like that's like data privacy stuff with like COPPA for kids and that kind of jazz. So it really depends on the type of regulations, that kind of stuff. But believe it or not, even if your business does not have a specific regulation applied to it, right? The Federal Trade Commission has already set the precedent that if your business is essentially demonstrating or implying that you guys have your business has a secure and robust security posture, when in reality it does not whatsoever and it is negligent, right? And that leads to some type of data breach or some type of event that occurs, right? The Federal Trade Commission, right, can come in and still fine you, right? Even if there's not a specific regulation. But most states now, like New York and whatnot, with like the New York Shield Act, right? They do have levels of fines, that kind of stuff. So these things do happen. Enforcement does happen, right? Still, is it as aggressive as probably it should be? No, not really. It's still, for a lot of organizations, a slap on the hand.
Piggybacking off of that, I think I'm not totally well read on it, but I do believe CMMC, the standard that is involved for DoD contracting, I believe they are more in line and more actively checking up on these items. That being said, CMMC is not in its full implementation. I think we're still in the grace period until like 2025 or 2026 or something like that. So once it's fully rolled out, I believe they're going to be doing a lot more active checking up on that compliance standard on that front. So yeah. But going back to what I'm doing real quick. So we only got like 6 minutes left, but I will try and cover just some high level stuff. So as I mentioned, NIST, let me share this thing, please. There we go. Center for Internet Security, NIST, as you might know them in a lot of capacities, they developed a policy template guide. This is not the gospel truth. This is not, to say all of your policies need to look like NIST. That being said, if you don't know where to start, these guys have actually provided a very solid couple of page document on overviewing important elements to address in your policy documentation. And depending on how you want to do things, you may do your policies in one gigantic monolithic sheet that's 50 pages long, and it looks really good. You might have a one source of truth sort of mindset there. Or if you don't think that somebody's just going to randomly read a 52-page document unless you're paying them to do it, i.e. someone like me, you can usually make things a little bit more digestible, break your policies out into something that you can distribute more to the appropriate parties, have them review it. So if you embed your acceptable use policy within this 52-page document, you're going to get a lot of rolled eyes. But if you manage to distill it down to like 2 pages, send that out on the first day of somebody's job, boom, you covered what you need in terms of your policy development standard. And of course, somebody's actually aware of what needs to be done in terms of a policy and procedure situation. So, but when it comes to actually what is the nitty gritty within this document, again, it covers a lot of these standards, a lot of what policies to look forward to, or what should be within those policies. Like, again, go back to our acceptable use policy, physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. Hey, that lets your employees and of course your staff, other staff know that you're tracking the fact that they have a computer that's been distributed to them from your company. That's as simple as it can be, simple as it needs to be. Obviously, you might want to put things in more mature language rather than, our shaggy presentator here. But the idea is that you are covering these specific elements that show you are doing your own due diligence within your organization to provide this insight, to provide this guidance, and a more practical means of doing things. And it covers everything from identify to protect, to respond, to all of those elements that you might consider for your cybersecurity posture. It's a good element to also address things within a sort of red teaming perspective as well, because if you are looking at these elements, you can confirm, hey, you guys are not in alignment with industry best practices, especially because we were able to just break into your system that way. So if you align to these best practices as defined by these guys, hey, you might be sitting pretty and can easily remediate these issues that we found. Now, when it comes to the risk side of things, risk can be managed and tracked in all manner of ways as long as it is being tracked. So a very simple way of doing things, a very common way that actually, we've distributed to some clients ourselves, is we just given them a spreadsheet. GRC guys live in spreadsheets, and we are more than happy to provide you something that is as complicated and as complex as you would never want to ever see. But of course, I want to look at things on a very simple level. Here's just a quick little example risk chart for HIPAA compliance. So there we can find some security findings that may be done during a gap assessment. And we've evaluated the impact of what's actually at stake. So if you have an organization that is not actually managing their BYOD policy, well, what's to stop some random dude from stealing your SIM card, popping it in their phone, and they act like they're you from there and basically, get past every sort of thing as they continue to break down whatever you got. That's a fairly high impact. You might want to fix that, especially when you are looking at anything related to HIPAA. Now, also the likelihood, that's a very big consideration, because if you have a high impact, but a very low likelihood, you may not need to remediate it too quickly. Security risk, as we had mentioned, like when you're talking cybersecurity, your big three domains: confidentiality, integrity, availability. Boom, we have a fancy little drop down there. Easy done, right? And of course, if you're looking at this and we try to define this within a compliance standard, that is usually what people are looking for when it comes to these sort of gap assessments that we wind up doing on the GRC side of things. We evaluate where people's posture is in relation to the compliance standard they want to or need to adhere to. So, and of course, being good due diligence people, we provide some general recommendations on how to get their stuff fixed if need be, unless it's just something like obvious, like just do that, send somebody to go do that, or make somebody actually enforce this sort of policy, because just because you have it doesn't mean it's being done. So high level of a sort of risk management system. A lot of people you also see wind up using ticketing systems. Like you can look at Jira. Jira is a very easy to implement system for this tracking. It's just, slightly more on the expensive side, maybe out of most people's wheelhouses, but pretty much everybody has Excel or Google Sheets and can spin up something like this. So that is a very simple way to deal with your risk management. Again, the concept is that you are documenting things so you can track them and see where they are in the process of being fixed or being accepted and being monitored. So with all of that, I have just hit on 9 o'clock, so I will stop sharing. Are there any other big questions that we are looking through?
Yeah, here, let's pop that chat open again here. Every time
Yeah.
it switches here, changes the chat modal box for me a little bit. It becomes a little bit more difficult to say. So yeah, as you guys saw, Travis dropped a couple of our pen testing reports into the chat for you guys to take a gander at. That gives you some just insight into how, again, we take a lot of opportunity to think about how we're communicating about vulnerabilities, security risks, and how we're able to actually exploit them, what the impact of the organization and business is in that process, right? It's certainly a lot different than our competitors. At the end of the day, I probably have some competitors on this call right now. Hell, Mike Ton here, who is one of our competitors, working for Net SPI. But I actually encourage people to steal from our reports and learn from them. If my competitors are better at providing security insight for their customers, it makes the world a more secure place, right? We're on the same team in that regard. I want good competitors. I hate shitty competitors who put out really piss poor pen tests, or they do a vulnerability scan, they call it a pen test. That's bad, right? So at the end of the day, take what insights you guys want from that. Hopefully it's helpful for you guys as you guys are launching off your own careers, that kind of stuff as well. So that being noted, Michael's like, oh, there's canary tokens embedded in there. You gotta watch out. There might be payloads. Any last questions or concerns, team? Best way to contact us. So we're on LinkedIn. So certainly feel free to reach out to us anytime on LinkedIn. I'm always looking at my messages there. Also, I'll just drop in my chat. One of the things that is particularly important. So this is my company email address. If someone wanted to talk to me about company matters or something like that, I do not accept usually personal emails. It'll usually go to spam by default because I just get so much spam. But if anyone ever wants to pick my brain, Mick's brain, Travis's brain about anything in cybersecurity or information security from a mentoring and training standpoint, just reach out to us via LinkedIn. We'll be sure to follow up with you guys. Okay.
And I just dropped my email in there as well. And I want to let you guys know I'm not just totally cutting you off because, yes, we missed the compliance side. Like I said, that's going to be a big bear to cover. We'll not be covering it next week, but perhaps the following week, unless we have a really big engagement to bump me. So
stupendous. Then that gives us more good content to look forward to. And at the time being, Travis and myself will find something for us to hit on for next week and provide you guys additional insight there. As always, guys, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your week now. Bye.
feedback survey.
Yeah, you know what? Thank you so much for calling that out. So you guys go to cyberjudo.com or cyber-judo.com. There's the feedback survey right in the top. Just click that link right there. Throw in some good feedback for us. We typically go through it like every week or every other week, right? And you guys can let us know what other content you guys want to see. And that's why we can get that onto the radar and prioritize that. Thank you for calling that out, Mick. Much appreciated. Thanks, team. Have a fantastic night now. Bye.
Yeah, take care, guys.
Thank you all.
See you guys.
You have a great one.
You too. Thanks.